Influence Continuum.
This is a podcast all about influence, not just destructive influence like the ones we see in cults, but also the ethical, healthy side of influence. Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And wow, am I excited about this guest, Dr. John Dehlin. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him and then we'll jump in. But I want to say first, John, that you reached out to me to be a guest on your podcast, Mormon Stories Podcast. And at first I was like, I had done a lot with fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, and I was like, do I really want to be on the Mormon Stories podcast? And you sent me a link to the New York Times front page story where you were excommunicated from the LDS Church, and you were thrown out because you spoke out as a mental health professional for gay rights and the suicide problem in the LDS Church, and they didn't like that you were raising these difficult questions. In any case, I said, John, I'll do your thing, but would you mind reading Combating Cult Mind Control first? And you said, sure. And then I'll never forget it. 2 days later, you emailed me, Steve, your book's blowing my mind. And then the next thing that happened was you had a color-coded bite model analysis, which I had never thought to ask people to color code. And I was like, wow, what a great idea, John. Thanks. So kudos to you. But I've been an admirer of your courage. You're a whistleblower. You're an activist. You've helped countless people to realize there's a whole nother side to this organization. If I'm remembering correctly, John, you're sixth generation.
That's right. Nice.
LDS.
Good memory. Yep.
Sixth generation. Okay, I'm going to read your bio and then we'll jump in.
Thanks, Steve.
So you have the Mormon Stories podcast. You are a CEO of a nonprofit. You're an activist, public speaker, religious transitions coach. I want to talk about that with you. You're an expert in understanding and supporting people experiencing religious faith crises and transitions. So regarding your education, you have a master's in instructional technology, a Ph.D. in clinical and counseling psychology. Your clinical training and research interests revolve around the nexus of religion and mental health, not a big surprise, with an emphasis on navigating religious faith crises as well as navigating LGBTQ religious identity conflict. So with your Mormon Stories podcast, how many subscribers do you have on YouTube now?
Man, it's been an amazing. So we just passed the 100,000 subscriber mark on YouTube, just like last week, and I'm over the moon thrilled. Yeah,
and I'm in awe and jealous at the same time. Good work.
But TikTok, we have like 210,000. Like TikTok is even crazier than YouTube. So
well. We'll get into all the incredible work and stories because I've learned a lot from listening to your podcast, I want to add. And your podcast is dedicated to supporting Mormons who are transitioning away from either Mormon Orthodoxy or Mormonism altogether. And you've been on every major media thing, from New York Times, NPR, ABC Good Morning America, Nightline, HBO's Vice, Wall Street Journal. It can go on and on and on. You have a TEDx talk that's really worth watching. And when we do the blog, we'll add the link to that, John.
Thanks.
And you're featured in the HBO's documentary film Believer, starring Imagine Dragons, Dan Reynolds, and Neon Trees, Tyler Glenn. So with that, I've been wanting you to come on my new podcast. And I should say, you asked me, you told me you should be doing a podcast and I can tell you how to do it. And if you want, I can set you up. And I was like, I don't want to do a podcast. I don't want to do it. And I finally got talked into it 2 years ago. I finally got around to it. But you're a pioneer on many levels. So you're that unique blend of professional counseling, psychology background. So for my listeners who haven't been introduced to your great work, can you give us just a thumbnail background and how you came to the point where you were excommunicated by the church?
Absolutely. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for having me on. Your work has been incredibly influential to me and to the hundreds of thousands of Mormons and ex-Mormons that I interact with, not to mention the broader impact on the globe. So thank you for having me on. Thank you for your work. It's an honor to be here. As far as my quick story, like you said, my ancestors go back to the founding of the Mormon Church in Ohio and Illinois back in the 1830s, which is when Mormonism kind of burst onto the scene. My ancestors were pioneers that either came over from Europe or who crossed the plains as Mormon pioneers in the mid 1800s. My grandmother, Karma, was the daughter of a third wife of a polygamous marriage. So my great grandparents were polygamists. I knew my grandma, so this is not ancient history. This is immediate in my life. My parents, my mom was from Idaho, my dad was from Utah, but as part of sort of a Mormon diaspora, I was raised in Dallas and in Houston or Katy, Texas. So I identify as a Texan, and I was a super devout Orthodox Mormon teenager in Katy, Texas growing up. And did all the Mormon things, served a mission, went to Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, met my wife there, got married in a Mormon temple in Washington, D.C., did the Mormon career thing, including working for Bain & Company, which I'm sure you've heard a little bit about in your neck of the woods. Mitt Romney was at Bain Capital. When I was working for Bain, I ended up in the tech industry in the early 90s. So I ended up at Microsoft and had 4 kids with my wife and was living the Mormon dream until around 2000, 2001, when I started studying Mormon Church history in depth. Believe it or not, I'm in my early 30s before I really start learning the factual historical truths about my own church, and had a major faith crisis, ended up losing my faith, but was inspired by secular Jewish and progressive Jewish authors thinking, well, we don't need to destroy the whole Mormon movement. We can just maybe help influence a progressive Mormon movement from within the church. So inspired by Reconstructionist Judaism and Reform Judaism, I left Microsoft in 2004, started Mormon Stories podcast in 2005. And the idea was, let me just interview a bunch of Mormons, talk about all the things the Mormon Church is uncomfortable talking about, and we'll create a big tent where progressive Mormons who might be non-literal in their beliefs or might even have criticisms of the church can still coexist in a big umbrella or a big tent of broad Mormonism. And that lasted about 10 years until the Mormon Church reprimanded me for giving a TED Talk supporting LGBTQ Mormons and same-sex marriage. They asked me to take my podcast down. I said, ethically, I just can't do that. So 10 years into my podcast in 2015, the Mormon Church excommunicated me. And that was the same year I graduated with my Ph.D. in clinical and counseling psychology. So for the past 7 or 8 years, I've been full-time running the podcast, running the nonprofit, doing workshops and retreats for Mormons in transition, and supporting Mormons in need, preventing divorce, trying to prevent anxiety and depression and even suicidality, trying to keep families together, and trying to do what you do, which is to help people build healthy and happy lives after high demand religion or cult.
Yeah, and I'm excited that you and I are talking about doing a workshop together. Very excited to do that because I respect you so much. And with
Likewise.
your decades of experience now, as well as having grown up in the Mormon Church, I just think you're going to teach me a lot. And hopefully, I'll share some of what I've learned that will be new to your folks and
Sure.
such.
And so,
So if I'm
listeners, your listeners should wait till the end of the show, and maybe we'll announce a little bit of what we're going to be doing together in March.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And for sure, I'm going to do a blog with the video of this, and we'll put all the links up
Excellent.
and such. But if I'm remembering correctly, so the Mormon Church is different than the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, where Warren Jeffs said that the Mormon Church went satanic because they abandoned polygamy. And I believe that may have been related to the main church wanting to have statehood for Utah and be recognized. But Warren Jeffs is in jail for trafficking underage girls, and so there's lots of information about that group. And I actually was asked by the Utah and Arizona state attorney generals to do a training on that group. And I was actually on Dr. Phil, I confess, not one of my favorite shows or people, but there were two young girls who had run away from FLDS who were not wanting to be married off to 60-plus-year-old men. And so I was asked to counsel them, which I did. They came to Boston. And that resulted ultimately in Warren Jeffs being pursued and arrested and put in jail. The cult continues. But because of that show, I got contacted by the ExMormon Foundation. I was like, who are you? Oh, we're the ExMormon Foundation. Would you come to Utah and explain your bite model to us? And I was like, well, I know the FLDS is a mind control authoritarian group, but is the LDS really? And they're like, come on out and let's talk. So it was a very, 250 ex-Mormons, some fifth, sixth generation. I gave a lecture on the bite model. I think my second book, Releasing the Bonds, had come out. I think that talk is still on their YouTube. But what blew me away, John, was the man who spoke after me. I think it was his talk was called something like Deception as a Management Tool of the LDS Church. And he started with the deceptions of Joseph Smith. And he was a teacher at their training institute for teachers. So he goes through so many things that I had never learned about before. And then he ends with a recording he made with his boss saying, so you're telling me I have to lie to my students about the true history of the church to keep my job? And the boss said, yes, that's right. And he said, well, I quit. And I was like, deception as a management tool. That's, right up the Mooney's model of mind control and deception about the past. Anyway, forgive me for that memory.
No, that's great.
But you were raised like so many others, believing gay people were deviant, they were not blessed by God, that they were in sin, if I remember correctly. And then you were in a work environment, made friends with coworkers, and then you realized they were gay, and you were like, wait a minute, they're nice people, and they're moral, and they're kind, and they're smart. So share a little bit more of that revelation about your coming to realize, wait a minute, some of the really central tenets are off.
Yeah, well, as far as the LGBT stuff goes, yeah, I definitely was raised in the 80s by my church to believe that homosexuality was not just a sin, but it was a perversion. That was a word that was used.
Yeah.
That it was not really much different than bestiality or pedophilia, that it was caused by things like masturbation or rape or abuse, and that it was one of the most grievous sins next to murder, basically, that is right up there. It's like murder, and then homosexuality would be like right under it. And that if you are gay and you're Mormon, you should either be celibate for the rest of your life or marry someone of the opposite sex and figure out how to endure your life, and then God, hopefully, if you're righteous enough, will fix you in the afterlife. And of course, the Mormon Church, along with Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians, were some of the main proponents of conversion therapy, including electroshock therapy, for decades and decades. So that would have been the environment I grew up in, a very homophobic environment. I don't think I was ever like overtly homophobic or abusive, but I certainly would have maybe listened to jokes or entertained jokes about gay people growing up in high school, and I certainly would have had thoughts about them being bad and dirty and sinful and perverted probably. So a couple things changed me. One was I had a couple cousins growing up who were some of my Utah cousins who in the 80s or early 90s came out as gay. And that was a really mind-blowing thing for a Mormon young adult to do. These were returned missionaries who had served missions. They not only came out as gay, they moved back east and just kind of disappeared from the extended family. One of them went to work at the library at Harvard University, actually. And so these were cousins that I knew and loved. And so I'm like, that's kind of weird. Regardless of whatever they do, why are they disappearing and moving across the country?
Right.
Then my wife's cousin, Scott, came out to us as gay while we were living in Seattle working for Microsoft. We loved Scott. And when he told us that he had contemplated death by suicide, that was another like chink in my homophobic Mormon armor, so to speak. In around 2000, 2001, there was a prominent story about a young Mormon returned missionary named Stuart Mattis, who drove to his local California Mormon chapel, walked up to the steps of the chapel, pinned a note to his chest that said, "Do not resuscitate," and forgive the graphic nature of what I'm about to say, trigger warning to all those who are sensitive or shouldn't be hearing graphic things. He shot himself and died by suicide on the steps of his Mormon chapel in California. I think it was Los Gatos. And that made the national news. And so it was during those years at Microsoft specifically where I just start realizing this isn't just like a behavior that like God doesn't approve of. This LGBT Mormon religious orthodoxy stuff is a matter of life and death.
Yes.
And as my politics got more liberal and progressive, as I started to develop more empathy for women, for feminism, for racism, that's when, after having my own faith crisis, I left Microsoft and I said, if Mormonism is going to continue, it's got to become less sexist, less misogynistic, less homophobic, less racist, and it's got to come clean about its history. And so Mormon Stories was created literally to target, those vile tendencies within Mormonism.
Including pedophilia cover-ups, I believe.
And the destruction of families, because Mormonism, one of its selling points is that we love Osmonds. We are bright and smiley and happy, and we love families. One of the dark secrets of Mormonism is the Mormon Church destroys many families because it's so common in my work where a husband or a wife loses their faith and their spouse says, if you leave the church, our marriage is over. And they might be alienated from their children. They might be disinherited from their parents. They might be cut off from their friends or their siblings or their community. This happens every day in 2023 in the Mormon Church. And all that stuff needs to stop.
Amen, if I may use a religious term. So there's so many bright, talented people who are open-minded, and they say, how could the Mormon Church be a cult? We have politicians who are Mormons. We have super successful business people like Mitt Romney, who was a presidential candidate. So please give us a 5-minute John Dehlin special.
Yeah. Well, I've been grateful for your education that so often we need to be able to use the term cult, because what do you call David Koresh or Keith Raniere or Warren Jeffs or Jim Jones or the Moonies? Like, if you can't call them a cult, you can't just call them a church. Like, they're in a category that needs to have a name. And you can call it a high demand religion or a cult. Obviously, using the term cult can be off-putting. It can create the backfire effect. And so it's almost never productive when you're speaking to a member of a specific church to address it as a cult. So with that disclaimer that I, you helped teach me about, what's just a bold-faced fact is that if the cult word has any meaning, if we use any criteria, whether it's yours or those who influenced you, like Robert Lipton, and others, whether it's Luna Lindsay Corbden's book, Recovering Agency, where Luna lists 31, tendencies or tools of undue influence, whatever criteria you use, the Mormon Church seems to line up as meeting criteria, as they say in the mental health biz.
Right.
So following your own bite model, if it's behavior, the Mormon Church controls what you wear to a high level. They control what you eat. They control what you drink. No alcohol. And it's not just no alcohol. It's no tea, no coffee, no marijuana, no psilocybin or psychedelics, white shirts and ties, short hair, no beards, one ear piercing if you're a woman. No more than one, no tattoos. Like, you could just go down the list for women.
The underwear, right?
Oh, yeah. You have to wear the sacred, holy temple garments that you get in the temple. And if you're a woman, you can't show your shoulders. It's pornographic to show your shoulders, to wear a skirt that's above your knee, to show your midriff, to wear a bikini. And this in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that an organization meets criteria, but that's just one. That clothing and diet, okay, that's two. Sexual behavior, the Mormon Church would teach that masturbation's a sin, that any type of premarital sex whatsoever is not just a sin, but is a sin next to murder. And not only is masturbation and sexual transgression a sin next to murder, but you've got to sit down with a bishop who's a middle-aged, usually white adult male. You got to sit alone with him, even if you're a 12-year-old girl or a 21-year-old young woman. You've got to sit in, behind closed doors with a middle-aged white Mormon guy and confess your sins in graphic detail to be able to get married in the temple or to be able to stay worthy in the church and not get kicked out. So, again, these things start piling up, and you realize this is a problem. So that's just behavior, and I could list 1,000 things more just on behavior. When it comes to information, the Mormon Church has 150 plus years of intentionally hiding and deceiving its members and the world about its problematic history. The fact that Joseph Smith was a treasure digger, a money digger, who engaged in occult practices prior to his work with the Book of Mormon and the church. The fact that Joseph Smith had 14-year-old wives, that he married other men's wives, that he married sister pairs and mother-daughter pairs, that he had over 30 wives. Over 10 of them were married to other men at the time he married them. This is information that is withheld not only from the rest of the world, but from most Mormons. And that's just the beginning about Joseph Smith. So hiding its problematic history and deceiving people about its problematic history and controlling the members' ability to learn anything factual about the church by either labeling factual information as satanic or as anti-Mormon, or excommunicating people like me, anyone who speaks openly about its history. The church has a history of excommunicating them, shaming them, ostracizing them, even smearing them through, arm's length, nonprofit, wealthy donor type techniques, a lot like Scientology. That's just the I. The T is, and so of course, as you teach us, they control the information so they can control your thoughts. And of course, within Mormonism, there's a legion of thought-stopping techniques that are used to tell Mormons, doubt your doubts, don't doubt, follow the brethren, have faith, hold fast to the iron rod, stay away from apostates, stay away from evil, excommunicants. In so many ways do they try and control the thoughts of the members, to the point where in 2023, you can go and find your average Mormon and say, hey, average Mormon, how many wives did Joseph Smith have? How young were his wives? Did he have sexual relations with his wives? What about the Book of Mormon? What about the DNA evidence related to the Book of Mormon? What about the Book of Abraham? You can go through the list of all the different ways the Mormon Church is problematic. What about John Dehlin? What about Mormon Stories? What about all these resources that would teach you about your own church? And most Mormons to this day in 2023 are oblivious to everything I just mentioned to you because of how effective the Mormon Church is in putting its members into a bubble so that they never learn the things they need to learn to make informed decisions, what I like to call informed consent.
Yeah, informed consent, exactly. I want to just say you listed off 30 incredibly powerful questions, but you're not suggesting to my listeners you ask them all at one time. You're just saying you can pick one.
Yeah.
Wait a long time, and they'll be like, oh, he didn't have any underage wives, or he didn't do this or that. And you told me the single best book was by Fawn Brody.
Absolutely.
Tell us about that book. What was the title again, John?
So Fawn Brody was the niece of one of our former prophets, David O. McKay. He was a prophet for like 20 years. His niece was named Fawn McKay Brody. She got a master's degree at the University of Chicago, and she wrote a book called No Man Knows My History. It's a biography about Joseph Smith. It was, I think, first released in 1945, if I've got my dates right, but she did an updated version sometime in the 1970s. She's a famous biographer. She did a biography of Richard Nixon. She did a biography of Thomas Jefferson, predicting his relationship with Sally Hemings and the fact that Thomas Jefferson fathered children with his slave Sally Hemings before DNA evidence could even validate that. So she's a credible historian, was on the faculty of UCLA, and she wrote this book, No Man Knows My History, which to this day, by far, is the best book to read about the Mormon Church's founder, Joseph Smith. Now, if I had a second book, there's a short 80-page book called Letter to a CES Letter or Letter to a CES Director, written by my dear friend Jeremy Runnels. And you can just type CES Letter or cesletter.org on your browser and get a free PDF, or you can buy the book. But
we're going to link to it in our blog for our listeners.
You can read.
Mind.
It's like a 6-hour read, and you can learn everything you need to know about the problems with the Mormon Church's truth.
Yeah, because Fawn did a very scholarly. If I have the book, it's a chunky read, but very scholarly.
Yeah.
And I want to just state, there's a problem always when there's a prophet, a living person who says, I am getting messages straight from God.
Yeah.
And the LDS Church has such a person today. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Joseph Smith, shocked the Christian world by saying that, God speaking to prophets didn't end with the Holy Bible and with the New Testament. I speak to God directly, and I speak to Jesus directly, and I am like Moses. I am like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Peter, James, and John. I'm greater than them all. No man did more for the salvation of mankind, save Jesus Christ alone, than me, Joseph Smith. And he basically started that tradition of the president of the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a prophet who literally speaks to God and Jesus. And I like to say that that no human on the earth should be allowed to say that they speak to God simply because that's too much power. And we have just untold abuse that always flows forth from any human that claims to speak to God. So to
Good.
and for God. And so I think that it should be, I don't know, somehow.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm totally with you. And I'm going to just mention in the Cult of Trump, I talk about New Apostolic Reformation churches and megachurches that comprise the base of the Cult of Trump. And every one of them have a self-proclaimed prophet or apostle who speaks to God and casts out demons and has that level of control over their followers. So, you know, if the leader says vote for X, they're going to vote for X. You know, they'll do whatever they're told. It's awful. And then the E of the bite model is
it's just emotion.
You're chosen, and please continue.
Yeah, just
Let's finish it up.
just emotional manipulation or influence, whether it's through the Mormon Tabernacle Choir singing amazing, choral arrangements, whether it's through fear of being separated from your family or being warned that you're under the guise of Satan. The Mormon or like telling people that sexual transgression is next to murder in severity. There are all sorts of ways the Mormon Church ramps up the emotional, pressure positively and negatively, even to the point of indoctrinating its members to believe that any negative emotion is a manifestation of Satan or the adversary. So that if a podcaster starts speaking truths about Joseph Smith, and then an Orthodox Mormon starts feeling uncomfortable, instead of going, why am I uncomfortable? Maybe it's because I've been lied to. Maybe it's because I'm learning things about my leader that I was never told and that are really problematic. Mormons are trained to think, I'm having an uncomfortable emotion. That's the influence of Satan. I better stop listening to this podcast or put this book down right now. And that's emotional manipulation.
Yes, it is. And phobia indoctrination.
Yeah. So, and Steve, we could spend a week on each of these, the B, I, T, and E, just within Mormonism and not do it justice. So this is just
and especially the 2-year missionary thing is really high on the BITE control.
Absolutely.
And just before we started recording, you were telling me that women are now being sent out to do these 2-year paired mission things. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, historically, Mormon men between the ages of 19 and 21 were encouraged to serve missions, or no, they were pretty much culturally required to serve missions.
Right.
And then women from the ages of 21 to 23 were provided the option of serving a mission if they hadn't gotten married yet. But it was optional, and it was only if you couldn't find a husband, basically. And that was true for a lot of years. Then in the 2000s and 2010s, after the internet started really bearing down heavy on the Mormon Church, they started to hemorrhage their millennial members and their Gen Z members to the point where it was becoming an existential threat to the Mormon missionary program. So in the mid 2010s, I don't have the exact date in my mind, the Mormon Church lowered the mission ages for men from 19 to 18 and from women to the ages of 21 down to 19. And instead of making it like not required for women, they basically said every 18 and 19-year-old young man or woman who's Mormon, who's worthy and physically fit and mentally fit should serve missions. And that's because the number of missionaries was tanking, and the church knew it had a problem. So ironically, there was this initial spike in missionaries when all the young teenage Mormon girls joined the fray to serve missions. But since then, that number has come down. Mormon young men are in droves deciding not to serve missions. And as I understand it today, if my numbers aren't incorrect, because the Mormon Church is not transparent about its numbers, there are now more women serving 2-year proselyting missions, and they only serve for a year and a half. But there are more young women serving Mormon missions than men. not because we've just got a bunch of women, but because men and women are more and more declining to serve missions. So
Yeah,
we
but
went
if
from
I-
like a high of 90,000 missionaries just a few years ago to like 40 to 50,000 today, and the numbers tanking.
Yeah, and if my memory serves me, I seem to remember a New York Times front page story about Mormons. I think they were in Europe who, because of the internet, were learning and looking at the original documents, and they were like, the church is lying to us. So the internet, I think, is playing a huge role in people's ability to get access to information without necessarily the church knowing about it. Is that correct?
Yeah, Steve. And I would say if I can have a tiny bit of Mormon pride just for a second, one thing I'm most proud of is whether it's podcasts or YouTube channels or TikTok channels or Reddit, our Reddit channel, ExMormons, I think, lead the world in ex-cult or ex-high-demand religion social media activism. The ex-Mormon Reddit has like 250,000 members. There are just infinite numbers of ex-Mormon TikTokers. There are a lot of amazing ex-Mormon or progressive Mormon podcasts and YouTube channels. And so I'm really proud of that. And yeah,
You should be. And the values of members, hardworking, disciplined, all of these qualities serve people to be very super uber successful in whatever area of life they choose to go into because of that upbringing and because they were protected in large measure from drugs and alcohol and other kinds of things that others were not. So kudos on that level. But I guess I want to go back and compliment you, because I think because of your podcast and the fact that you're sixth generation, LDS, you towed the line, you went to BYU, etc. You're so credible as a psychologist, and you make so much sense, and you're so warm and empathic. So I think that's hugely important. I also want to just take 1 minute. People don't realize how many really high-profile people are ex-Mormon. And I was just reading about the New Zealand head who said, my tank is, run out. I believe her name is Ardeen. I hope I remember her last name properly.
yeah.
But I was surprised to know
Ardern.
she's...
Yeah, Jacinda Ardern.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ardern.
Yeah.
But she's an ex-Mormon.
Yeah.
And who else is... So B.J. Fogg at Stanford Persuasive Labs is an ex-Mormon.
Yeah, like
I was just reading about a billionaire, Brian Johnson, who has made $1 billion of PayPal or something related to financials, and he's putting money into neurotech to try to figure out what causes dementia and how to live longer. And he's an ex-Mormon too. There's so many really high-level, successful people. Talk about that.
yeah, the list is quite long. David Archuleta, who was runner-up at American Idol, he's recently come out as gay and is distancing himself from the church. Randy Bachman and Tal Bachman of Bachman Turner Overdrive, or BTO, they're ex-Mormons. Dan Reynolds, the lead singer for Imagine Dragons, along with Wayne Sermon, who's the lead guitarist. They're out. Tyler Glenn, who's the lead singer of Neon Trees, he's out. Aaron Eckhart is a famous actor. As I understand it, he's ex-Mormon. Ryan Gosling, another. Katherine Hagel. There are so many. Will Swenson is an actor and a Broadway performer. Alex Winters is he's in the UK. He's a famous BBC children's TV presenter. Bruce Bastian was one of the co-founders of WordPerfect. He's a billionaire. He's out. Nolan Bushnell.
I think we're gonna cut it off now, because I have a feeling there are hundreds, but maybe we should make a list, and we can make a link to it in our podcast. I mean, in the blog.
There's so many.
But it's, and I do want to share quickly, I just read a book called Cured by a psychiatrist named Jeffrey Rediger. And I'm reading his book, and he's talking about a woman who was given a terminal diagnosis, and he just mentions that she had been in the Mormon Church, but never connected the dots that maybe this is related to her stress and high cortisol levels and the internal conflicts that were left over that she had never processed, because he wasn't trained to work with cult members. And Dr. Rediger just took my foundational course, a 9-hour course, and he said all mental health professionals need to understand this as a dissociative disorder with very unique, specific issues. So I'm very excited just to mention the ex-Mormon. There's so many people, also ex-JWs, are in psychiatric hospitals, and nobody stops to think about the fact that they were beaten as children and were shown videos of Armageddon as children, and why go to college because Armageddon's going to happen at any minute. And a lot of these folks are gay. It's another homophobic cult, as was the Moonies. In any case,
yeah,
I want to come back, if I may, to the prepper movement and the $100 billion and the gun caches and food caches.
Yeah, the prepper thing is real. You know, I guess the Jehovah's Witnesses and others are famous for kind of like end of times, predicting when the world is going to end sort of thing. But the truth is the Mormon Church is called the Church of Jesus, is named legally the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because Joseph Smith predicted that the world was going to end likely in his lifetime. And those prophecies, while the formal church has tried to de-emphasize and distance itself from those teachings, they're there encoded by our founding prophet and most beloved leader. And so in 2023, you've got tens, if not hundreds of thousands of conservative, sort of right-wing, Republican, almost, MAGA following, Trump loving kind of Orthodox Mormons who buy massive amounts, who stockpile massive amounts of handguns and rifles and assault weapons and ammunition, who buy tents and trailers and food storage, all under the assumption that within the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be some massive earthquake and Mormons will be, called to go to Missouri or to Ohio or the hills of Utah and set up tent cities and prepare for the coming of Jesus Christ. And this sounds fanatical. This sounds like some extremist small cult, but this is a very large and significant wing of mainstream Orthodox Mormonism. The same church that Mitt Romney's a part of is the church I'm talking about. And it's led to all sorts of extreme behaviors, including the Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow story about this couple that killed several of their own respective children and spouses because they were going to be this messianic couple that ushered in the coming of Jesus Christ as a part of this prepper movement. They're now sitting in jail waiting for their court date in Idaho.
It's tragic when children are killed in the name of God or in the name of salvation and such. So John,
and I guess you asked about the 120 billion.
Oh yeah,
you want
please.
To talk about, yeah, just for a long time, the Mormon Church has not been transparent in its finances. I run a nonprofit. The federal government requires me to publish a 990 every year, which is disclose my finances. For some reason in the United States, religions have convinced the government that they don't need to be transparent in their finances.
It's called lobbying.
Yeah, and they're somehow exempt. So for a long time, no one knew how much wealth the Mormon Church had. They could only speculate. And then just in the past 5 years, it was leaked that the Mormon Church had like $120 billion just in stocks and bonds and real estate and cash that we know of. And if you add to that what normal organizations like this have in their diverse investment portfolios, plus all of the core assets of the Mormon Church, we are easily somewhere between a $500 billion and $1 trillion church. This makes us the most powerful and the wealthiest church in the United States. And that is,
wow.
That's Mormonism. We're wealthier than the Catholic Church in the United States.
And I notice you say we're.
Yeah, because just like you know, what do you call a Jew who doesn't believe in God and who doesn't believe that Moses exists?
A Jew.
I think of myself as a Mormon, even though the church excommunicated me.
Got it.
But a cultural Mormon, not a believing Mormon.
Understood. So I want to ask you to talk about colonization and its effects around the world, because we were just talking about missionaries, but talk about, its effects around the world.
Yeah, well, one of Joseph Smith's genius moves was from the very beginning to send men on foreign missions to preach the gospel. Now, some would argue he did that so that he could proposition their wives. I think there's decent evidence that happened in multiple instances. But regardless, what that did is that started an immediate influx of immigrants from other countries to, Ohio and Illinois to help bolster the early Mormon movement. So we have a long, long history of missionary work. I myself being a part of that, going to Guatemala for 2 years to serve a mission. And, a huge amount of the growth in the Mormon Church has been fueled by this, foreign missionary
recruitment
movement.
Is what I say.
You call it what?
Recruitment.
Yeah. And to this day, now over 50% of the formal, on paper, members of the 17 million member Mormon Church live outside of the United States, and primarily reside in Latin American countries, in the Philippines, and now in Africa. Now that's deceptive. There are not 17. The church says there's 17 million Mormons in the world. The truth is there's probably only 4 to 5 million people who identify as Mormons in the world. A massive percentage of those the church claims to be members were baptized by Mormon missionaries in developing countries when they were 7 or 8, never ever attended church, never had testimonies, and fell away immediately after being baptized or just within a few months. And so there's a massive retention/attrition problem in the Mormon Church. Now, having said that, we are still the only place in the world where the Mormon Church is growing, if you factor out the birth rate of U.S. Mormons, which is, on average 3 per couple, that's what's keeping the Mormon Church from being in decline in the United States. But the only other place where the Mormon Church is growing is in these super poor countries, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, but anywhere else in the in the world, whether it's Canada, many places in Latin America, and certainly in developed Asia and in Western Europe, and even Eastern Europe, the Mormon Church is in sharp decline. So that doesn't answer, I'm kind of talking about colonialism, but to this day, where the Mormon Church is ramping up its efforts is in Africa. Africa, go back 30 years, the Mormon Church prohibited Black members of the church from being members in full fellowship. They couldn't receive the priesthood if they were men. They couldn't receive the temple ordinances if they were men or women. It was a racist, institutionally, structurally racist church. It still is in many ways, but it certainly was 30 or 40 years ago. Fast forward to today, Africa is practically the only area of growth for the Mormon Church. And so you'll see the Mormon Church investing in missions and temples in sub-Saharan Africa while it's closing down missions and chapels everywhere else in the world.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So I understand that the Mormons in the U.S. were required to tithe 10% Is that
not just in
correct?
the U.S., in the world? In fact, you can find many, many, many statements from top Mormon leaders, including apostles, telling Filipinos, telling Ecuadorians, pay your tithing before you buy shoes for yourself. Pay your tithing before you buy food. And I'm not exaggerating. Mormon prophets, seers, and revelators are on record teaching members in developed worlds that they pay their 10% before they buy food or buy shoes.
And that's gross or net of
Well, see,
income?
the church intentionally leaves that ambiguous so that at worst, they pay 10% of their net. But many Mormons say to be a legitimate Mormon, you got to pay on the gross.
Wow, and they're so wealthy, $120 billion. They should be subsidizing these African members and feeding them.
The annual budget for the Mormon Church and the annual revenue that the Mormon Church collects right now, separate from its investment income, is around $8 or $9 billion a year. So with an operating budget of, let's just say, $7 billion a year, the Mormon Church, just with its residual tithing income, putting these hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investments aside, just with its annual tithing receipts, could fund its own global budget. So there is no need for the Mormon Church to be telling its developing world, third world members to continue paying tithing, because if you then add in the literally tens of billions of dollars the Mormon Church earns in Tesla investments, Microsoft investments, Google investments, the Mormon Church owns between 2% and 4% of the public lands in Florida. Think about that.
Wow.
Like, the Mormon Church is probably the largest private landowner in the United States, with all of the holdings and the stocks and the bonds and the assets and the municipalities and the cash that the Mormon Church has. It does not need another dollar of tithing revenue, and it could still become $1 trillion church if it isn't already. So but
it's tax exempt also.
It's all tax exempt. And so the fact that it's requiring its third world or developing world members to pay 10% of their income, or they can't see their own child get married in a Mormon temple, is it's outrageous. It's egregious.
I think it's evil.
It's kind of evil. It's kind of evil.
It's really awful.
Yeah, and I'm not
honestly,
exaggerating in any
I
of this.
didn't believe that. I thought it was just the wealthy Americans would pay the 10%.
Oh, it's worldwide. There you can actually Google, Mormonism tithing. I have a channel called Understanding Mormonism where I put together in like a 20-minute video excerpts of Mormon apostles telling its third world members to pay tithing. I'm not making this up. You can
we're adding that to the blog too, please.
Absolutely.
We have to make a list of all these incredible resources you've developed over the years. So, wow, we've covered a lot of different points. I agree with you that for me, reforming institutions, especially if they've been around for a long time, is the way to go. What's the chance of the next prophet, getting a revelation and addressing all of these, improprieties and deceptions? Is that a possibility, or do they have to toe the line of Joseph Smith was a great guy instead of a criminal?
So the good news is, and I'll say this is, tepid good news, is that the internet has forced the Mormon Church to make changes that at its own historic pace has been have been very rapid. So once the Mormon internet came on the scene in 2004, 2005, and the world became aware of just the LGBTQ suicide epidemic, of all this massive wealth of the church deceiving its members, the Mormon Church has been forced to start to make changes. So whether it's trying to be more transparent in its history by releasing a set of gospel topics essays, whether it's softening its LGBTQ rhetoric by no longer claiming that it's a sin to be gay, it's only now a sin to do gay or to act in sexual ways, whether it's trying to show more love and compassion for LGBT people, whether it's trying to excommunicate less public voices. The Mormon Church is slowly making baby steps in a positive direction. It's also starting to try and give women a little bit more visibility, a little bit of more leadership responsibility, although still to this day, the core leadership in the Mormon Church are white males. Women are excluded from the priesthood, and they're excluded from the top levels of decision-making in the church. The church is responding to the internet primarily because it's hemorrhaging its millennials and its Gen Z members, and basically its attack on the LGBTQ community is now reverberating, and it's causing the church to self-destruct. So just today we're going to be doing an episode about how the Mormon Church is potentially starting to backtrack on its LGBTQ policies, but Stephen, it will take decades for the Mormon Church to become fully transparent in its finances, to become fully transparent in its history, to allow same-sex marriage, to allow women to hold priesthood office, to remove the racist teachings from the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses and the Book of Abraham. So we have decades to go, but the good news is the internet is forcing the church to start to make positive changes.
Well, I'd say the people using the internet, like yourself, are forcing it to be accountable. So we're running out of time, but I needed to ask you about Mitt Romney, if I may, because, I live in Massachusetts. He was our governor. He pushed through health care reforms that were amazing. And he was one of the few people who stood up to Donald Trump in his evil deeds, but he was treated so badly by Mormons. Talk to me about what was going on? What were people in the hierarchy of the church saying, no, we need to support Donald Trump, and therefore encouraging it? Or what's your take?
Yeah. So I don't know how much you know about Mormon history, but a Mormon was once Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Dwight D. Eisenhower picked a Mormon apostle named Ezra Taft Benson, who's actually a cousin of mine, to be Secretary of Agriculture. Ezra Taft Benson not only was Secretary of Agriculture, he was a proud supporter of the John Birch Society and a massive conspiracy theorist. So starting in the 1960s, you see this Mormon apostle teaching conspiracy theories and ultra-conservatism to its membership. And ultimately, in the 80s, my cousin Ezra Taft Benson became a president and a prophet of the Mormon Church. And that's what's behind this prepper movement and this sort of right-wing support, because you won't find many states in the United States more red, more supportive of the Republican Party than Utah. Maybe Wyoming, but you won't find...
I think Utah wins.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Utah, in Mormonism, being Mormon and being Republican have become almost synonymous. And I would say 75% of Mormons in the U.S. are strong Republicans. And so, while Mormons loved Mitt Romney when he was completely, supportive of mainstream Republicanism, as soon as the Republican Party turned in kind of the Trump direction, the minute Mitt Romney showed disloyalty to Donald Trump, he became an enemy, not just of the Republican Party in many instances, of the base, but also of the Mormon people. And that's why I consider Mitt Romney to be a personal hero, even though he remains, maybe even because he remains a faithful Mormon, but was willing to stand up with the courage and integrity against not only his party and the President of the United States, but also against most of his own people. Mitt Romney is a hero to me.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And I remember before Trump was elected, he did a whole speech about what a con man he was and how dangerous he was to America.
Yeah.
And then he was invited after Trump won to interview for Secretary of State. And at that point, I was like, oh, Mitt, you were so good. And then, what happened, dude?
Yeah.
But
And
this is-
answer your question, I don't know that the Mormon church leaders are telling the members to hate on Mitt Romney. I'm sure there are many who do hate Mitt Romney, but
Yeah.
it's more that the genie's out of the bottle, and it's more that they're not more courageous. Like if Mormon church leaders speak to God and Jesus, and if they are followers of Jesus Christ, there's no way a single Mormon should be voting, in my opinion, for Donald Trump, not because of his politics, just because of his moral and character failings.
Yeah.
And so putting partisanship and policy aside, there's not a Christian alive, in my opinion, that should be voting for Donald Trump if they take their Christianity seriously. And my biggest criticism of Mormon church leaders is that they haven't openly and publicly denounced Donald Trump for his lack of basic moral decency.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, our hour has flown by, and
we haven't even talked about multi-level marketing, Steve.
I
Mormon
did want to
Church.
mention that is the capital of the U.S. for multi-level marketing. Okay, go for it, John.
No. There's so much. There's chronic levels of depression and suicidality in Utah, of pornography use, of prescription drug abuse. Utah is beautiful and it's a mess. And the Mormon Church has a lot that it has done to contribute to the mental health crisis that is Utah, and multi-level marketing schemes are a big part of that as well. So, I love Mormon people. I'm
Me
proud
too.
of my heritage, and the Mormon Church and the Mormon people have a lot of work to do to clean up a lot of messes.
Yep. So John Dehlin, Dr. John Dehlin, a clinical psychologist, a podcaster, CEO of a nonprofit, and you do a thing called Thrive to help do outreach to support people, and I'm hoping that we'll be together in March and do some things together there. I want to thank you profoundly, brother. I'm so looking forward to meeting you in person and giving you a big hug, because you deserve it.
Yeah, and we do want to bring Stephen Hassan to Utah the week preceding March 18th. So go to thrivebeyondreligion.com and you'll be able to find details about Steve's visit to Utah. And mormonstories.org is where you can check out the podcast. Stephen, you're a legend. You're a hero to me and so many people. It's an honor to be on your podcast, and thanks for all you're doing. We stand on your shoulders.
Thank you, and I learn every time I talk with you, and I want to learn more. So thank you, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Stephen.
Take care.
Take care, you
Bye.
too.